name is Jim Ludema, and I am the Director of the Center for Values-Driven Leadership at Benedictine University, and I want to welcome you to today's executive education session, Understanding Identity and Leadership, with our very special guest, Dr. Stephanie Creary from the Wharton School of Business. I will be the host on our webinar today, and I want to begin with just a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll share a bit of the context for today's session, and then introduce Dr. Creary. After that, we'll invite Dr. Creary to speak for about 25 minutes, and we'll wrap that up by around 12:30 Central Time. But then Dr. Creary and I will remain on the call for about 15 more minutes for Q&A. And if you have time to stay with us during that Q&A, I would encourage it, because I know that the discussion will be very rich. As it relates to housekeeping, we ask that you please keep your audio on mute and your video off. That will allow everyone to hear Dr. Creary clearly and also prevent any background distractions. But we definitely want to hear from you to get your questions for Dr. Creary. And to do that, just use the chat box in your Zoom screen. And it has been enabled so that you can speak to the host of the meeting and ask any questions that you have. We'll reserve the questions for the end of today's session, but you can send them anytime you like. So to send a question, all you have to do is click the chat button and select Center for Values-Driven Leadership and type your question. And those questions will be received by my colleague, Amber Johnson, who will collect them and moderate the Q&A session with Dr. Creary at 12:30 Central Time. But you can send those questions anytime during Dr. Creary's presentation. Brief word about the Center for Values-Driven Leadership. Our mission is to help values-driven leaders develop themselves and others to build flourishing companies and to have a transformative impact on business and society. And we believe that if it is truly flourishing and transformation that we want, then perhaps the most pressing issue of our time that we must address as academics and as business leaders is the reality and the destructive impact of systemic racism. This belief has led our center on a long-term journey to better understand racism, diversity, equity, inclusion, to amplify the voices of diverse leaders and scholars, and to take action. And one form of action is to host this free executive education series on addressing racism and building inclusive organizations, of which today's seminar is the second. You can find a recording of our first session, which was done last month, and also registration for our next session, which will be done in August, on our website at the Center for Values-Driven Leadership. And Amber will post a link to that in the chat box now. Separately, I want to mention that our center is home to a PhD program designed for senior executives, in which we dig deeply into the theory and practice of leadership at every level, including leading diverse and inclusive organizations. The program is a 3-year program, so leaders can pursue their degree while leading their companies. And so if you've ever considered earning your doctorate, we invite you to our online info session next week about the program, and Amber will also share a link to that. And now, without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephanie Creary. We first met Stephanie a couple of years ago at the Academy of Management annual meeting, where she was wowing rooms full of eager academics with her insights and compelling research into identity, diversity, and inclusion. Stephanie is an assistant professor of management at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where she leads the Ideas Lab. And Ideas stands for identity, diversity, engagement, affect, and social responsibility. And Dr. Creary's research centers on understanding the identity and diversity work that individuals and leaders engage in to improve the quality of relationships across differences at work. And she's widely published in this area, including a great piece that came out just yesterday in the Harvard Business Review titled, "How to Be a Better Ally to Your Black Colleagues." And it's a tremendous piece. I encourage you to read it. Stephanie holds a bachelor's and master's from Boston University, an MBA from the Simmons University, and an MS and PhD from Boston College. So Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today, and we really look forward to learning from you. I will now turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that wonderful introduction, and I'm so grateful to be here. So thank you for the invitation to share with you several insights that I have. Certainly, I've added some language in here around building positive relationships across differences, because I see that as a mechanism between individuals' identities, and certainly in constructing what I will talk about as positive identities in the workplace, and certainly creating leadership experiences that hope to make our organizations inclusive and effective for us all. So thank you also for mentioning my new piece. It was great timing, came out yesterday. I will definitely be sharing some insights on that work, and certainly where that came from. But to get us started, let me go ahead and take us to this broader theme around what does it mean to take a positive lens on work and organizations, because I think that's important. First of all, as we're all trying to cope with the current context under which we're all working and living, two crises, if not more than that. I will just name the ones that I'm thinking about, and certainly the COVID-19 pandemic, and certainly the continued era of racial injustice in the US and around the world. I do feel that in contexts such as this, taking a positive lens is helpful if we are to come out of this, I think, in a place of learning, but also a place of where we can grow from our experiences. And so my research necessarily takes a positive lens. Just personally, in being somebody who has committed herself to studying issues of identity and diversity, it also brings along with it having to understand the hard experiences that we all have in organizations. And so for me, being able to understand the positive lens on work in organizations has certainly allowed me to thrive and flourish when I'm examining things that are often very difficult. And so Jim has already used this word, human flourishing is certainly at the heart of work and practice that takes a positive lens. And what we're really trying to understand is how do we create conditions and processes that are generative for us as individuals, but also for our organizations as well. And so certainly this is rooted in research in positive organizational behavior. Positive organizational scholarship is the domain of scholarship that I often contribute to, but also there's a field of positive psychology. And taken in total, all three of these scholarly perspectives contribute to this idea of what it means to take a positive lens on our work and our organizations. And so there are certainly some assumptions that I think are important to point out. When we're taking a positive lens, we're really trying to understand or really what underlies our motivation is in understanding and in communicating that there's potential for good. So in any bad situation, there's potential for good. So there is hope. There's also potential for development or learning. And there's also potential for trust. We just have to begin to identify and tap into those mechanisms. With that said, what people who take a positive lens to work in organizations are fundamentally understanding is that there's value beyond traditional indicators of performance, like revenue, value beyond understanding revenue. There's value beyond understanding cost. There's value beyond understanding productivity. Those are important, but there's also things like human energy. There's also things like hope. There's also things like humility that become really important to understand how we thrive and generate positive outcomes for ourselves and for our organizations. That said, the negative is still important, and certainly in the research that I do, so much of it is focused on understanding how to work around the negative. So there's two ways of thinking about the negative in research on positive relationships or positive organizations or positive organizations or positive leadership. And that is that you can see that someone's good intentions can lead to bad outcomes. So we're looking at the unintended consequences of individual behavior or policy that are developed at an organizational or systemic level. Where I often lie in my research interests and my teaching and my practice is, how do we look at obstacles and problems? How do we look at injustice and equity? How do we look at the lack of fairness? How do we look at the lack of voice? And how do we figure out how to turn that around and create good outcomes for us all? So I want to center that and help you to understand that becoming an important question for many of us who do this work. It's the negative, it becomes a central part of the questions that we're asking. But it's this understanding, I think, from my own research, that in thinking about the potential for good, that allows us to understand how to turn something that's not so great into something that's better. I also want to acknowledge that there's this larger question around positive or negative for whom. What's positive for me might not be the best situation for you, and vice versa. So those become important questions to ask. And then what are the implications of that? I think we live in a world, especially as we talk about businesses, where so much of what we've created is based on a zero-sum economic mindset. My wins are your losses, and certainly we see people acting in that way. And it's no doubt, right? Because resources can be scarce. And so it means there might be a limited potential for everyone to gain what they need to feel supported and to contribute. But in my research, what I try to do is help people to understand the innovative ways in which they can create collective gain, even by looking in the smallest places. So as negotiation experts would say, how do you expand the pie, and how do you expand it so that we all can benefit as well from whatever initiative is that we're trying to run. So that said, I want to talk a little bit about identities in the workplace, what they mean and what they do, before we talk about why they're also important in the context of relationships at work and certainly for leadership. So identities are, by definition, they are the meanings that we use to define ourselves. They're self-referential. They are multiple, they are multifaceted, they're dynamic. So you can have an identity at one point in your life, and later on in your life, it may become less meaningful, or maybe that's not at all something that you use to define yourself when somebody asks you the question of who you are. They can also, you can accumulate more identities over time. So if you become a parent, that might be a new set of identities that you're dealing with. Also, as we're talking about dynamism, I want to address the notion of how you feel about your identity. So I could feel one way about my identities in a certain situation. So I'm also bringing this idea of them being situationally activated. So I could feel great about my identity as a Black woman when I'm at home and around other people who look like me. But I can enter into a workplace, and the context, the conditions of that workplace can make that identity feel less positive and less valuable. So these are all things that are important when we're thinking about identity. Now that's different from a social category. So an identity is not something that somebody else ascribes to you. I'll talk a little bit about social categories on the next page, because I think it's important in the conversation about identity, especially if we think about the conversations that we're having right now about race. I've been doing work on diversity, inclusion, and identity for 14 years, and it goes without saying is that so many people who might check the box as white might have a hard time having a conversation about their white identity. That might not be something that fully feels meaningful to them, but I might call them white categorically. And so I think as we're having this conversation about identities and categories, what we need to understand is sometimes what becomes hard to talk about identities is because the difference between what we feel and how we see ourselves and how other people are defining us, sometimes that becomes the barrier. The interesting thing about this, I do want to say, even though I'm saying it's not something else that someone else ascribes to you, I'm not saying that other people's opinions don't shape how you see yourself, right? So you can decide. I always give my students the example of, so I'm a professor and identify as a professor. It's very hard for me to wake up tomorrow and say, you know what, I'm a banker now, because bankers have all sorts of standards that they believe are important for you to be accepted in the category of the community of people who identify as bankers. So there's a social negotiation process that is important that necessarily affects whether you feel like you can continue to call yourself, in this case, a banker, if everyone else rejects you. And we can certainly see that in the news in the past, 10 years. We've talked so much about people who might identify as Black, but their parents might identify as white. And so what does that mean to label yourself or identify as part of a category when no one else around you believes that that's who you are? And certainly we see that as we're talking about people who are transgender. The idea that being transgender is fundamentally having an experience of oneself as a man or a woman, or maybe not identified with these binary categories. But the reality is that is your experience, and how must it feel to have to negotiate that when everybody else has decided based on your biology, what you were born with, that predicting how you see yourself. So these are important things to remember. It's hard to continue to call yourself and refer to yourself as part of a category when other people might reject you. And so that's the thing that we're always trying to negotiate. My last example of this is the identity as leader. And certainly this speaks to the diversity literature, where we see that people who are in the minority, whether they're female or whether they are underrepresented racial minorities, might have a harder time, and research suggests have a harder time becoming legitimated or validated for their identities as leaders, because the standards that we often have around who is a leader is often the picture of someone who is male, and often someone in the US who is white. And so having to negotiate that and having to have someone call you a leader is often a process that is harder for people who are in the minority with respect to how we typically view that category. And again, I'm talking about many of these identities I'm talking about are visible identities. There are also identities that are less visible, such as, sexual orientation is a less visible identity, religion, social status. And so these also are identities that come into a larger conversation around how people see themselves in the context of work. And why this becomes important, what I'm setting up, is this idea that identities necessarily influence how we think, how we feel, how we act, and how we engage with others in the workplace and in any social environment. And I think certainly as we've been subject to thinking about our own identities in the context of being under quarantine conditions, and certainly watching racial injustice play out repeatedly on the television or in the news, I think we're thinking a lot about our identities now more so than ever as a collective global society. So there are lots of categories. I've just included some. There are categories that are normally things that you probably would check the box on in the context of your employment in the first category, in the first column. In the second column are things that also might be meaningful to you. And in the third category, or the third column, are sets of professional roles. And so what I want to submit to you, and what the research suggests, is that we don't all identify with any of these categories, or the ones that I'm leaving out, in the same way. So what I typically ask people to do when I'm in an in-person environment is say, I want you to look at these, and certainly you can add if you want. And I want you to say that if somebody said to you that you could only have these categories to talk about yourself, which ones would you choose and which ones would you get rid of, and why? And then if somebody said, if you chose 5, and if somebody said to you, well, the reality is you have 5, but you could only have 2. Which ones would you get rid of and why? And as we start to feel some discomfort with this activity, we start to be able to address this question around what's important to us, what's really meaningful to us, and what are some other aspects of that are potentially self-defining that may or not be as meaningful to us. Okay, so let me sort of add some richness to this conversation and talk about a positive identity. And again, that's taking the positive lens on the study of work and organizations, and certainly self in this context. And so Jane Dutton, Laura Morgan Roberts, and Jeff Bednar wrote this fabulous Academy of Management Review piece in 2010, and looking at the construction of positive identities in the workplace. And since then, as they've continued to talk about this work, and Laura Morgan Roberts, who spoke during the last event on this topic, she has been my collaborator for 13 years. She and I have also done work that has adopted this positive identity frame. But what it does is, using this acronym and this mnemonic of GIVE, suggests that these are the conditions under which people might feel positivity towards their identity, or might feel positive about their identity. And so when the identity is growing, when they feel like they're becoming more like their desired selves, when they feel integrated, that the different parts of their identity are connected in compatible, enriching ways, when they feel that their identity is virtuous, that they possess virtuous qualities such as compassion, courage, wisdom, humility, and they're able to display those at work. And when they feel that there is a certain level of esteem, so they feel that themselves, or you feel yourself, that you regard who you are and that identity positively, but that others regard that identity positively as well. So that's what I mean by when I talk about a positive identity. That said, identities can be under threat because of the situations in which we work and live. And so what the research tells us is that identity threat is an experience, a subjective experience, so an experience that we ourselves appraise as indicating potential harm to one or more of our identities. We certainly know that identity threat for some people is a short-lived experience, and for others, it's a constant situation that they're experiencing. And so if we're looking at what allows some identities to feel constantly under threat, and if we want to be able to change that, what's important to first recognize that what actually doesn't help to get rid of the threat. So in the short term, if you try to change other people's identities or change other people's attitudes about your identity, what we find is that that's not as effective. It's probably a bit counterintuitive. So trying to justify to somebody who you are and why that's valuable in the short term has been shown research-wise to actually maintain the identity threat for you. And that's probably because it's ego defensive, right? It puts you in a position of where you're constantly defending who you are. And so it's not helping you to reduce your sense of threat. Actually concealing an identity that has been threatened, so hiding it, still maintains the sense of threat. It might make you feel as if you're barricading yourself against future assault, but that's not the same as getting rid of the momentary experience of threat. Or, I think it's what we often do when something threatens us, when we feel threatened, is we blame the other person, or we name call, or we somehow put it back on them. So discrediting people actually doesn't reduce the threat. What research suggests is it prevents sometimes future attacks, or it just incites further identity threats. And so what the research says is actually, if you're trying to reduce the sense of threat that you have and that you're experiencing, the best thing is that you continue to feel positive about yourself. Self-affirmation is a powerful tool for reducing identity threat and putting yourself into conditions where you focus on what your strengths are, what you have to contribute, and why that identity is meaningful to you. Research suggests it is certainly tied to actually reducing the sense of threat. Okay, so let me add in some more around the context, and certainly the context that I like to talk about a lot is the relational context. And so I want to bring in some of my insights here around building positive relationships across differences. And these differences, for the case of today's conversation, you should think of them as identity differences. And I also want to talk about leaders as being allies, since that ties to the work that I'm working on right now. And so it goes without saying, there's lots of research to say that positive relationships at work are beneficial to individuals. They help us to feel better from a physical standpoint, from a psychological standpoint. They allow us to engage more fully in our work. And they also increase our willingness and our capacity to learn from others. And from an organizational standpoint, our increased capacity and willingness to learn also increases our capacity to collaborate more collectively across work units. People who have positive relationships at work are more likely to feel connected, like to feel that they belong, and also they're more likely to stay in their organizations. And as a whole, it increases our capacity for learning when we have positive relationships at work. And so this is the name of the piece that I just published yesterday in Harvard Business Review. LinkedIn says it's a 7-minute read. I never know if those estimates are accurate or not, but I think it's a quick read. I will share with you some of the insights behind the LEAP tool, which I talk about in the context of this article. Now, what I did was I took a tool that I've been working on for 3 years now, which is about general, how do you create better positive relationships across differences broadly. And in this article, I focused on today's context. So in the context of you have Black colleagues who need allies, how do I apply my research to this specific context? So the LEAP tool in and of itself is broad, but in this article, I talk about it more narrowly. And so I always give people this image of this woman who is taking this extraordinary leap over some nondescript body of water, and she has a life preserver on. And I like to think about the LEAP tool as being the life jacket for people who are maybe a bit concerned around talking about differences, around engaging in people from different backgrounds, engaging with people from different backgrounds. And so this tool is designed to help you feel like you have something to go on to make these interactions much more fluid and much more effective. And so in the context of this conversation that we're having, we all at any given point in time need to recognize the privileges that we have as individuals, and that can come from our gender, that can come from our race, that can come from our ability, that can come from our sexual orientation, that can come from our status in the organization. And all of that we're bringing with us into these interactions, and the other person is responding to us based on how they perceive our privilege. So recognizing that and treating that with some degree of humility is really important. And I think also embedded behind the idea of the LEAP framework is this idea of learning to empathize. And so it's hard to engage effectively if you're just focused on I or in the me space. But relationships and in building more effective relationships is about learning to put oneself, or at least try to get inside someone else's shoes to understand their experience. So LEAP stands for listening, engaging, asking, and providing. And I will just share with you some general ideas to unpack this a little bit more in the next few minutes. And so listening would be this idea that you're looking for opportunities to listen to and to learn from people whose backgrounds differ from yours in some way. And in the context of the HBR article, I talk about this as listening and learning from your Black colleagues about their experiences at work. Engaging is about meeting with people in casual and informal settings, because if you're really trying to get to know people, stepping outside of the formal evaluative context becomes really important, because people feel vulnerable in formal evaluative contexts. And so if you remove them from that context into something that feels less threatening, they're more likely to share more of themselves with you. And in the context of the HBR article, I talk about this as engaging with Black colleagues in diverse and casual settings, which could be the context of an employee resource group where Black employees are meeting to just gain insights from one another. They're often open to people of different racial backgrounds, but it becomes a great context for people to come and learn about the experiences that Black colleagues are having at work. Asking is about asking what people are working on that feels exciting, that feels engaging, what they're hoping to accomplish, any concerns that they have about attaining that outcome, because that becomes information, data for you for the last step. Briefly before I move on to the providing, in the context of the HBR article, I talk about asking your Black colleagues what they're working on. So, and I say this because much of the research shows us that a lot of the interactions that Black colleagues have with their other colleagues at work are about their personal lives, about their appearance, or about things that are really not about their work. And so the challenge then becomes for Black colleagues to actually get help with their work and have the focus be on their work, not on these other things that aren't necessarily as helpful in the context of helping them to achieve their dreams and their aspirations. So asking about the work is really, really important. And then finally, providing is actually that provision of support, sponsorship, mentorship, opportunities, advice, suggestions, encouragement, and general help. And in the HBR article, I list a wide array of things that you can do to provide this type of support to your Black colleagues. I want to mention that it is very hard to say negative things in the context of a workplace. And by that, I mean it's very hard for people to speak out when they see things that are happening that are wrong. When somebody says something that is not a kind or a civil remark to be making, or when somebody sees mistreatment. But understand that your Black colleagues face these experiences, often described as microaggressions, on a regular basis. And so you becoming somebody who says, hey, that's not okay, becomes really important to stop these types of things from happening and taking over our workplaces and making them toxic. I just want to give you a couple of scenarios, other than the ones that I've shared, where leaping can become really important to you in the day-to-day. We network, we go to, well, now we're going to online conferences, but there's many ways in which we're networking in the virtual space and in the in-person space. And so that's a prime context where you can try out some of these tips. When you're picking people for your team, how you think about who you're picking and why, leaping becomes important. And certainly when you're looking at who you support, who you offer career development and psychosocial support to, what talent you're developing becomes important as well. So hopefully those will narrow down the field of possible settings in which you can try leaping out. The word that I want to leave you with, which I always try to leave people with, obviously because I also have a positive in orientation, is growth. It's hard, right? Everything feels hard right now, and everything is taking a long time, but I would submit that the more that we try, and in this case, the more we try to leap, the more that we will grow in our relationships with others, and the more that we will grow as leaders and as prospective leaders. And so I thank you so much for your time, and I'm really happy to answer any questions that you have. Stop sharing.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much for that. And we do now want to move into a period of Q&A. We'll do that for about 15 minutes. And so we invite you to submit your questions using the chat box. And in the chat box, select Center for Values Driven Leadership and type in your question. And that will send your question to Amber Johnson, my colleague, who will be moderating the questions along with myself. Maybe Stephanie, if I could, I'll start off with a question that came up for me. One of the things that you talked about in terms of overcoming a sense of threat to your identity, what doesn't work and what does work, and what you said does work in the short term is to maintain a sense of positive self-regard, which when I stop to think about that, that's a very profound insight. And at the same time, I know that as a white man, I have shame, I have regret, I have pain around the impact that I have had and others have had on our Black colleagues. And so how do you sort of like move forward with that sense of positive self-regard and those other feelings of pain, shame, whatever the case may be?
Yeah, so Jim, knowing you and knowing the work that you do, I know that the virtuous identity that you have is really the one that you want to magnify in this context. So when we go back to the give model, the V being the virtuous identity, there are all these other ways in which you identify as a compassionate person, as a person who believes in pro-social motivation, who is ethical. That's the part that I think you're trying to, and anyone else who is feeling shame and guilt and all of these negative experiences right now, you're trying to find and resource, right? That's the word that we like to use, is how do you tap into that to help you overcome what is feeling hard? So for you, it would be, if you're a person, and I think this is how this series comes out, right? You've already said that, you know, as a white man, you feel this shame, but then you create this, you tap into your virtuous qualities and you decide to create a speaker series, an amazing series with people who you know and you enjoy their research, to actually amplify the parts of you that actually are important. And actually in doing that, you support the rest of us. So it's about finding the part of yourself that is the good and using that to help you find who your true self is. And I think in this case with you, it's that person who is kind and compassionate and who wants to develop and grow other people, in spite of the fact that, yes, there's that lingering shame and guilt from this other experience that you have. Does that help?
Absolutely. Yeah, great.
Okay.
Thank you. Very, very powerful.
We have a
Go ahead.
I was going to say, we have a related question. You know, Stephanie, you answered that. How can Jim think about his own have positive self-regard for himself? But how can we help other people, our colleagues, find that positive self-regard for their identities in the workplace?
Yeah. So my work with Laura, we have a chapter in a book the book is called Mentoring Diverse Leaders, and it's co-authored by Audrey Morrell and Stacey Blake Beard. And so we wrote a book applying this give-based framework to mentoring. And so we walk through this framework, the G, the I, the V, and the E, and we talk about as somebody who is in a mentoring position, right? And this doesn't have to be a formal mentor. We're using that as like a developmental, right? Somebody who's in a developmental capacity. How do you help someone else unearth or resource their identity as somebody who is growing, who's learning? So how do you, for the trying to help someone to develop a more positive sense of self around their development, is how do you introduce them to opportunities to learn and grow and develop? Because that helps them to become more positive or feel more positive about their identity on the growth of the developmental dimension. The integrated part is hard, right? So, you know, I remember Laura and I writing this chapter, I said, you know, it's like counseling for ourselves as we're writing this, because the integrated thing for me as a Black woman has always been a very hard thing in the context of a workplace, because my identity as a Black woman is very positive at home. And when I go to work, it's like, don't talk about race, you know, the whole narrative. And I'm not saying like my current workplace, but just in general, workplaces broadly. It's a don't talk about that aspect of your identity. It's a that aspect of your identity connotes for people things that are terrible and stereotypical, right? So it's not a positive experience there. And so what we talk about in terms of how do you help somebody who has this really paradoxical experience around a single identity, how do you help them to continue to reinforce the positive aspects of their self? So what we've talked a lot about is counter narratives. As I show up at work every day and I talk about how wonderful it is to be a Black woman, and here are all the reasons why. I'm not trying to convince someone else. I'm just trying to introduce new ideas into the context. So that's just the G, the I. The book chapter goes through the V and the E as well.
That's terrific. Thank you. Let's keep on the topic of the GIVE framework. One of our commenters loves it and asks, you know, can you teach it in a specific context? And in her case, it's healthcare, teaching medical students, but it could be other contexts. How can we use it in specific contexts to help open eyes to disparities in healthcare and racism that might exist? Yeah.
So what was not in my bio, but if you look closely enough, you will see that I worked in healthcare for 15 years. I actually worked while I was in my PhD program as well. So that's sort of why there's a lot of overlap. I've always had multiple jobs, and people tell me, this is why you're perfect for academia, because we're always doing 9,000 things at once. So I actually think a lot about positive identity construction in the context of what it meant to be a healthcare provider, as a worker in that context, what it meant to be somebody whose job was to help other people who had something terrible happen to them in their lives. So either was an accident or had grown into this, you know, had grown up with developmental disabilities. How do we help somebody who has to navigate a world that does not often bend to their needs? So I think you put that in as a situational variable, but you also put that in as like the target of this work. In the context of disparities, healthcare disparities, we have come so far as a healthcare community to being able to say that on a regular basis, to be able to acknowledge it. I want to suggest that in addition to saying that we don't get equal treatment, that our providers have their own opinions and make subjective assessments around the care that we need that often isn't founded on our best interest. So we're saying all that, and science is producing that. I think the reality is we're also contending with the fact that in this case, racism itself, is actually a disease. It creates stress. It creates, and stress breaks the body down, and the healthcare community knows that. And so as we're talking about give in the context of healthcare communities, we have to expand the ways in which we're talking about who, like the providers and the people, the idea that they want to have positive identities as well. So I hope that helps with the question.
Terrific, thank you. So one of our participants mentions that, you know, your model asks us to speak up. If you see something, say something, but that can be really difficult to do. And I wonder if you can offer any insight in how to do that, and maybe even share a story of someone who managed to find a way to be an ally in a situation.
Yeah, so I have another, I actually do mostly qualitative research, but I do have some studies that are quantitative, because people start asking, you know, enough questions around, does any of this stuff work? So I end up figuring out, right, it's time to do that study. So one of the studies that I've been working on for the past 2 years with my colleagues at Wharton is looking at the array of organizationally based diversity and inclusion practices, such as mentoring programs, such as education and training, like diversity training, unconscious bias training, things like organizational policies. And so speaking up is actually one of the behaviors we're interested in understanding. Is like, how do you get more of that behavior? And the behavior that we're talking about is something we call prohibitive voice. So telling people not to do something, which is different from promotive voice, is telling somebody to do something, right? So with prohibitive voice, what we found out is the more that people participate in, or I should say, the more that people feel like they have access to other people who are doing this diversity work, who don't have a formal diversity title. So what I mean by is the more that they feel like they have access to an employee resource group, and that's a community of people who often don't get paid or rewarded for doing diversity work, but do it. The more that they feel that they have access to a diversity council. Now, a diversity council is often comprised of senior people in the firm, i.e. white men mostly, who are actually taking accountability and responsibility for talking about diversity. The more that we see that happening, the more that we feel that it is safe to actually speak up. And so there's a certain part of this conversation that really is about creating the systems and the structures that validate that speaking up is really important if you actually want somebody to do it to begin with. And then there's personal courage, right? There's conviction, and then there's tapping into your own virtues. If you say that you feel positive about your identity when you are compassionate, then you will speak up, because that will also be something that allows you to enact the truest sense of yourself that you want to be.
Great, thank you.
Great. Amber, I think we probably have time for one more question, and then we should wrap things up.
Yeah, terrific. Okay, this is a really good question. I'm glad we get a chance to ask it. One person writes, you know, as a representative of a diverse colleagues at work, she spends a lot of her time code switching, and it's the habit she's formed, and it's part of what's allowed her to be successful. And yet she wants to be able to bring her whole self to work. So what can organizations do to systemically encourage and celebrate employees to bring their whole selves to work?
Yeah, so I get the code switching thing, and certainly as a personal story, as I've gotten older, I'm like tired, because as I've gotten older, I have more responsibilities. And so it's harder to do all the things that one needs to do to code switching around. And so what we mean by that is there might be a certain way that you engage or interact on a regular basis. So I might wear my hair a certain way at home, I might dress a certain way, I might speak a certain way, and then when I go into the workplace, I might shift everything to conform to what the dominant norms are. And as we're talking about this in the context of diversity, we often call those norms dominant Eurocentric norms, right? That are very much devoid from the experiences of people who are in the cultural minority. So that's extra work. That's extra work that I have to do, and other people who aren't part of the majority group have to do in the context of work. And we've learned to do this our whole entire lives, and some of us have had to do it more than others. So when you're busy, or when you've been doing it a long time, it becomes really frustrating. You don't want to have to do it anymore. But the only ways in which you can, I think many people feel like they can comfortably do it, is when the rules in the organization change. So this whole movement around bringing your whole self to work, that really wasn't, you know, it came about as organizations were trying to attract the younger employees, because many of the younger employees grew up with these mindsets and these value systems around authenticity and being yourself that people who were older did not grow up with, right? And so it's created sort of a cultural evolution in organizations where we say it's okay to be your whole self. Now, the reality is when people have been code switching for a long time, it's very hard to just say be yourself and tell us everything about you and for that to feel right. So what I tell companies is if you're going to create some messaging around the fact that it's okay and you don't have to code switch, you need to give people the license to continue to code switch if they want to, right? So it's bring as much or as little of yourself to workplace as you want to. So that said, there has to be structural and cultural acceptance of this in order for you to do it. And I would say, you know, I think about this as I always give the example of my hair. I have dreadlocks and I've had them for 5 years and I have run the gamut of having straight hair and all kinds of hair. And it just was not worth it anymore to me as a human being. And it did not align with my positive identity to chemically straighten my hair. So I stopped doing it. And what I learned is I just let it grow out of my head as it did. And nobody said anything. Right. But I also work in academia and I understand that there's legislation out there now. It's called the Crown Act that has made it illegal in the United States and 7 states to discriminate against people based on their hairstyle. We don't have federal legislation. We don't have federal legislation in Pennsylvania where I live, but I'm still just going to wear my hair the way that I want to. Right. So sometimes these are just personal choices. And I'm going to work in a place that doesn't care about my hair. And so for you, the person who asked, I would say, you also need to find, to the extent that you're available, and that's a privilege, right? An environment that allows you to be the closest version of yourself that you want to be.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. I think that we're going to have to bring things to a close here for the sake of time. We could go on and on. It's a fascinating topic, and you have given us very much to think about. I really love both the give model and the leap model and how, and your explanation of how those can be applied both at the personal individual level and at the organizational, more institutional level in important ways. Thanks for your very well researched and insightful and applicable insights that you provided with us today. As we close, I want to remind all of you that our August session in this series is titled Actionable Steps to Advance Inclusion Now, How Values-Driven Leaders Can Create Belonging. And that will be with Dr. Stephanie Johnson of the University of Colorado Boulder, who just recently published a new book by that title, or a title close to that. So definitely use the link that Amber sent out to register if you haven't done so already. We'll also, I want to also remind you that we have the link to our executive doctoral program also in the chat box, and we will be having an online info session about that program this same time, noon Central Time on Thursday of next week. So please join us, and we'll have a couple of current and graduated students on that online info session, as well as some of the faculty. Finally, I just want to thank you all for attending and doing the work of addressing racism and building inclusive organizations. We're glad to be in this together. And again, Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. And with that, we are adjourned. So long, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.